Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Altesse Royale, Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight on behalf of Bridge Forum Dialogue and on the premises of the EIB for this evening with, on the program, a speech by Minister of Finance, Minister Tsakalotos from Greece, who will be introduced by President Hoyer. I'm afraid that contrary to the program, there is a good chance that at the end of the speeches we will not have time for question and answers, so I encourage you to listen carefully now. President Hoyer.
Monseigneur, Royal Highnesses, Ministers, Presidents of the European institutions here in Luxembourg, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to, also on behalf of the Governor of the Central Bank of Luxembourg, Gaston Reinisch, to welcome you to the Bridge Forum. Recovering from the crisis, macroeconomic versus real economy and social dimensions. That is the task that Minister Tsakalotos has taken upon himself and to talk about. The topic could hardly be more relevant for Europe these days. After a period of the most enduring crisis in living memory, much of Europe is beginning to observe a period of investment-led recovery. The recovery is yet weak, although advancing at somehow different pace across Europe, but the signs are there. And so is the potential path how to strengthen it, how to stabilize it, how to make it real, tangible across the entire European Union. In particular, we as policymakers need to address the rather philosophical principle of solidarity in the Union, how the benefits of recovery are to be shared. This indeed, a question of the balance we strike between macroeconomic considerations and the social dimension. Across Europe, and arguably the recent referendum in the United Kingdom was a clear example, the question how can we ensure that our economies work to the benefit of all our citizens is coming ever more to the fore. Nowhere is this balance more important than in those economies that have suffered most in the crisis. And no economy, no people have suffered more than Greece. The crucible of resistance, as was the title of Mr. Tsakalotos' book in 2013. Our speaker tonight is uniquely qualified to address the challenge reconciling hard economic performance and social justice. Minister Tsakalotos, dear Euclid, a very warm welcome to Luxembourg and to the European Investment Bank, the EU Bank. It's an enormous pleasure to have you with us tonight. Professor Tsakalotos is an economist. He studied politics, philosophy, and economics at the Universities of Oxford and Sussex in the United Kingdom and completed his PhD in 1989 at the University of Oxford. He then worked as a researcher at the University of Kent and later taught at the University of Kent and Athens University of Economics and Business. And since 2010, he's professor of economics at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. He's the author of many books, and he has published numerous articles in economic journals, as well as political articles in newspapers and magazines. In 2012, he was first elected for Syriza as Member of Parliament of the Hellenic Republic. It was re-elected in January and September 2015, and he's a member of the Central Committee of Syriza. In July 2015, he was appointed Minister of Finance of the Hellenic Republic, a post to which he was reappointed after the elections in September last year. He is reported as having said at his first press conference, "I am not taking on this job at the easiest point in Greek history." So he's a master of understatement as well. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Tsakalotos' first official meeting as Minister of Finance was an emergency meeting of the Eurogroup. The following day, the government submitted a request for financial assistance to the ESM Board of Governors. The leaders of the euro area countries reached an agreement with Greece in July 2015 on the actions to be implemented in order to start negotiations of a reform agenda and set out in a memorandum of understanding 4 priorities. 1, restoring fiscal sustainability. 2nd, safeguarding financial stability. 3rd, boosting growth, competitiveness, and investment. And 4, reforming public administration. In the something over 1 year of his stewardship of the Greek economy, fiscal and external current account development is consistent with the view that the economy is rebalancing. The liquidity situation of banks has also improved, and the ECB has again accepted Greek bonds as collateral. Yet, the minister is all too well aware that domestic demand remains weak, especially with fiscal consolidation ongoing. Unemployment remains excessively high, and the financial sector continues to struggle with legacy assets. Minister Tsakalotos, we look forward to learn your views and plans to transform a fragile recovery into a sturdy one, balancing the needs of macroeconomics with social responsibility. And it is a pleasure and an honor and a duty of the EU Bank to be of assistance. We were active in your country over decades, before the crisis, long before the crisis. We were, one can say, the multilateral bank who stayed during the crisis. And, Minister, we have the intention to stay and even boost our business in Greece in the next years. We have established, in a clear deviation from the normal setup of our business activities, a dedicated investment team in Greece under very strong leadership, and we hope we will be able to show that the EU Bank can make a difference. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming here tonight. I think we can expect a very interesting intellectual experience. We can expect inspiration from our speaker tonight. Minister Tsakalotos, the Euclid, the floor is yours.
Your Royal Highnesses, the Presidents of the institution, Minister, it's a great pleasure to be here, to be part of a dialogue, the Bridge Dialogue. It's important because Europe, as I will be arguing, is at a crossroads. Before that, let me thank Werner and thank my hosts. What he said is absolutely true. As many of you will know, commercial banks have a tendency to lend pro-cyclically. That means that they lend a lot of money when times are good, and when times are not good, they turn the tap off. But the EIB has been with Greece in good times and bad times. And of course, we've had a lot of bad times. So we are grateful for the past commitment. We are grateful that there is a long-term commitment, and we are excited that there are new projects that we've been discussing and which I hope will come into fruition very quickly in research and development, in small projects, and also with the refugee crisis, which is one of the most recent issues that we've been discussing. Let me get to the subject of my talk, saying it's not very easy to make a talk in front of your banker. In fact, I thought there would be 2 of my bankers today here, Klaus Reglin being a second one. He's had to go, fortunately, to Brussels. There's a 3rd banker that's not far away in Frankfurt. I will be making some critical comments on all 3, but I hope not too many. Let me start with the macroeconomic prerequisites. When I taught the economics of monetary union, we used to tell students, and there's a book by de Grauwe, a Belgian conservative economist that is taught in nearly every university on the world, we used to say that there was a unified, unique monetary policy in a monetary union, but unfortunately, perhaps or not, no unified fiscal policy. The first does not hold anymore. A key characteristic of the post-financial crisis in the euro area is that the single monetary policy has broken down. It is no longer the case that financial conditions are the same across the Union. Credit growth is still negative in peripheral countries compared to most core countries. The dispersion of interest rates across the euro area is still considerable, and country inflation rates are likewise showing a dispersal, with a number of countries having suffered a long period of deflation. Greece this year is at last going to have positive inflation, but has been one of the the greatest sufferers. Other peripheral countries have similarly not benefited from the loose euro area monetary policy because of deposit outflows during periods of heightened risk, causing banks to lose liquidity, because of lack of access to international markets, following fears over the stability of particular financial institutions, and rising spreads on sovereign debt placed floors on interest rates much above the ECB's refinancing rate. Greece has been most affected, and for the longest period of time, but other peripheral countries have experienced these phenomena at various times. Why has the single monetary policy not been transmitted more evenly across the euro area? Aside from interest rates, the other main policy tool which the ECB has been using is the quantitative easing, which includes the purchase of both public and private sector assets. Along with government bonds, the Eurosystem central banks are also buying corporate bonds, covered bonds, and asset-backed securities. That is, instruments which are issued by the private sector, both banks and companies. Why are these programs struggling to ensure the appropriate monetary policy stance throughout the euro area? There are a number of reasons I could suggest. First, the distribution of purchases is not linked to financial conditions in different countries. Heavier purchases are in countries where financial conditions are tight and deflation is a problem. Rather, the distribution of purchases is linked to the capital key. So instead of monetary easing, quantitative easing, going to countries that have the lowest inflation and need the most amount of quantitative easing, it's going to the northern European countries that arguably don't need it at all. Second, firms and banks in peripheral countries have greater difficulty issuing corporate bonds, covered bonds, and asset-backed securities. The corporate bond market is largely accessible only to larger firms. SMEs are generally excluded. It is often difficult as well for banks to bundle up loans from SMEs in order to issue covered bonds or asset-backed securities that meet the rating criteria laid down by the ECB. Thirdly, when compared to the Fed, which bought up toxic assets in the aftermath of the failure of Lehman Brothers or the Bank of England, the ECB is over-concerned with the amount of risk it is assuming on its balance sheet. In short, its risk management department adopts a commercial bank approach to risk assessment. It is for this reason that we have numerous limits to the type of instruments and the amount that can be bought. Limits by user, limits by issue, floors on ratings, haircuts on collateral linked to risk. I hope Mario will still be speaking to me by the time I get to Washington. In short, QE is not getting through to where it would do most good. But there is a social aspect. The issue of quantitative easing means that it stores up assets and the price of assets, which means the benefit goes to the richest section of society. QE is increasing the type of inequality that is at the heart of populist politics in Europe. In addition, by raising the price of assets which are purchased, QE could also generate asset price bubbles. This stores up problems for the future, with collapsing asset prices potentially having detrimental effects on the real economy. Don't get me wrong. If the question is to QE or not QE, then I'm in favor of QE. But the question is it the most appropriate instrument? And are there other instruments that we should look to? The obvious answer to most students of economics is investment. So that is why it's important I'm giving this speech in this building. With respect to infrastructure, core northern countries are effectively able to borrow at 0 interest rates at present. Moreover, we know that there are plenty of investment opportunities to replace and upgrade outdated infrastructure and perhaps build new infrastructure. When I return to my university, I will be unable to explain to my students why Northern European economies did not invest in infrastructure where interest rates were 0. It cannot be the case that there are not investments with a positive net present value when interest rates are 0. And of course, the other side of the coin of having low investment in the northern countries is that they have a current account surplus. Germany has 9%, I think, Holland has equally high. The rule is that they should reduce it. But as George Orwell would say, all rules in the European Union are equal, but some rules are more equal than others. Now a second way of looking at what we need. With respect to firms, we have to increase the funds that are available to small and medium-sized enterprise, which provide the backbone of economic activity and employment in the euro area. SMEs cannot rely on capital markets, and there are limits to securitization that I have already mentioned. This is where the institutions such as the EIB and the EBRD have a vital role to play. The recent announcement by Jean-Claude Juncker in his State of the Union address that the 315 billion investment plan for Europe has to be taken further with a doubling of both its duration and financial capacity is to be welcome. Now, let me turn to fiscal policy. There is a big debate in Europe whether we have fiscal transfers are needed or whether, as Mario Draghi has suggested, we should just concentrate in areas where we can cooperate and spend money together, for instance, the refugee crisis. I don't want to get into that issue directly, but I want to say that something has to be done about the coordination of fiscal policy. It is a well-known result of economic policy that in a fixed exchange rate system with free capital movements, fiscal policy works. Now, one of my bankers, not Werner, has made an argument recently that we do not need fiscal transfers as we have in all other monetary union, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and of course in Germany itself with the center and the lender. We don't need fiscal transfers because the capital markets can do the job. Now, that, I think, is fundamentally mistaken because it fundamentally misunderstands the structure of the European economy as compared to the American economy. The American economy can indeed rely quite heavily on the capital markets to sort out the job, but I do not believe that this can happen in Europe. The reason for this is exactly what I have said previously. In Europe, we have a large number of small and medium-sized enterprises, and we have a large number of small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly in Southern Europe. It is very difficult for capital markets to do the job when they are usually lending in hundreds of millions, if not in billions. Moreover, it is very difficult to securitize loans for small and medium-sized enterprises because there is such a cultural and legal difference between the countries. So I do not believe that capital markets can replace the fiscal transfer or greater fiscal expenditure at the Central European level. It could be the case that fiscal transfers are not needed, but we have to think of new directions. Because if we do not have a larger budget, if we do not have fiscal transfers, if capital transfers will not work, then there is only one instrument that works within monetary union, and that is the real wage rate. And what does that say to European people? It says that the whole burden of adjustment is taken by workers wages. If you want to know what was behind the Brexit decision, in part it was that wages of both working class and middle class people have not increased since the crisis. That is the issue we have to deal in the Eurozone. If the Eurozone tells ordinary working people that they are the shock absorber, that every time there is a shock, an asymmetric shock, wages will take up the slack, then I find it very difficult to believe that the Eurozone will get out of the crisis. And that's why I want to turn now to the social issues. The governor of the Bank of India, called Rajan, who in my view is a brilliant economist, before he became governor of the Bank of India, wrote a piece shortly in the Financial Times, shortly after the crisis. He said there that after the crisis, we now know we can't grow as fast as we thought we could grow before the crisis. That means we cannot adhere to all the contracts we made before the crisis, which were based on expectations of higher growth. The question, Rajan said, which contracts are we to break? Are we to break the contracts with creditors? Are we to break the contracts with pensioners, who we said if you work for 30, 40 years, you will get a decent pension? Are we to break the contract with the young people and the future they have? Are we to break the contract with people who need hospital care? And Rajan gave a warning to elites. He said, even though he was a Chicago-trained economist, an IMF economist, he gave this stern message to the elites. If you give the impression or the reality that the only contract that matters is to creditors, you are in serious trouble. And that trouble, I think, now has a name. It has a name in Farage, it has a name in Le Pen, it has a name in the Northern League in Italy. It has to be based, the social basis of coming out of the crisis has to be a proper balancing of all the contracts. You have to respect, you have to make a hierarchy. No contract will now be fulfilled to its full. Everybody has to take a share of the adjustment, but it cannot be that it's only one-sided. The issue is that inequality now is also a middle-class issue. What was the promise of the true believers in globalization over the last 20, 30 years? That this is about textile workers, old steel workers, they have to worry, but the young people and new industries don't have to worry. But if you visit Britain, jobs are going to India, which are nothing to do with textiles, they're nothing to do with steel. They are middle-class design jobs in architectural offices. They are accounting jobs in accounting offices. They are teaching jobs in cramming school that you can now teach through teachers and tutors in India. That's why globalization is seen by so many people as a threat, because now it's not an isolated, separate group who we can deal with in some ways. It's a large part of society. So let me now turn finally to the real economy. It's a bit risque to mention Marx in this audience, who discussed in terms of over-accumulation of capital, and that the capitalist system hasn't got enough profitable opportunities. And I wouldn't have mentioned it unless modern economists are reaching the same conclusion. Larry Summers, who is as establishment as you could get in America, head of Harvard, advisor of Clinton, I mean, it would be difficult to be more establishment than Larry Summers, talks of a glut of savings. What does that mean? That there are trillions of funds now at zero interest rate or or negative interest rates that cannot find profitable opportunities. So the real economy is central to the whole argument of getting out of the crisis. It's not just finding investment it's also finding the profitable projects, and that's why the real economy is so important. Let me now say something about Greece and to give you my view of how the real economy fits in with both the social aspect and the macroeconomy. Greece is now returning to growth. We expect 3 consecutive quarters of positive growth, the second quarter, the third quarter, and the fourth quarter. This would have been even stronger after the closing of the first review had we not had so much bad news outside Greece. We had the Italian and Portuguese banks, some worries there. We had Brexit. We had the semi-coup in Turkey. We also had the continuation of the refugee crisis. We also had the issue of debt and the IMF not taking a final decision of whether they're in or out, whether they will be part of the program. What does that mean is that Greece has not given investors yet, even though it's coming out of a crisis, a clear runway. The key political decisions have not been taken. It's very simple, and presumably most people in this audience know it better than me, that if you tell private investors the political decision will be taken in 2 years, then they will say, okay, I'll invest in 2 years' time. If you tell them the political decision will happen in 5 years, they'll say, fine, I'll wait and I'll take the major decision in 5 years. So it is critical for the Greek economy that we have a deal on debt. Only then will there be this clear runway to be able to, for investors to know, we know the rules of the game, we know that Greece can respond and cope with its gross financing needs over the next 10, 15 years. But let me now say that even that isn't enough. And let me say here is something that I agree with Wolfgang Schäuble, the opposite of what you'd expect me to say. Because I agree that even if all the debt was written off, complete Greece would still have a problem. What I am saying is that I am confident that Greece will return to growth in 17 and 18 in the next following years. But that isn't the goal of my government. The goal of my government is to return to growth in a sustainable way. And a sustainable way does not mean a return to the status quo ante. There was something deeply wrong in the Greek development model in the post-war period, in the period before 2008, and we need a new development model that addresses that issue. And to link it to the social, we need a development model that is fair. Lagarde talks about inclusive growth. Other people talk about just growth. What does just inclusive growth mean? In my view, it means 3 things. It means first that you take workers with you, that they feel that they have some confidence that they will share in the good times, not just sharing in the sacrifices of the bad times. That's why for my government it is so important in the second review of the program that we have an honest compromise with the IMF on the issue of the return of collective bargaining. It means fairness in the regions. Behind the Brexit and many other crises in Europe, political crises, are important regional differences, that growth does not seem to affect all regions. This is an issue in Italy, it's an issue in Britain, it's an issue in Greece. And finally, just or inclusive growth means that people have some access to the political decision-making process. They must feel, and this is the European feeling that is driving populism, that they have no control over things that affect their lives. And having control means they have some input in the development policy, whether it's at the peripheral or the local level, and some feel that whatever it's been decided is what's going to happen, some accountability ex post. So economic development is the key, and the Greek government needs to present, and it will be presenting over the next 2 months, its new development strategy, which must have clear priorities, which must ensure that it has the financing for those priorities and it specializes in particular areas. We had a discussion with Werner earlier today where we discussed and seemed to agree, I think, I'm not putting words in his mouth, that the old idea that investment is just big roads and large projects should be rejected. We need a lot of money going to small projects. The way I think of it is in terms of Aesop's tales. So I think the Greek government needs to be much more like a fox and less like a scarecrow, a hedgehog, sorry. You'll remember the tale, the hedgehog knows one truth, the fox knows many truths. And what the Greek government needs, a lot of foxes knowing a lot of truths about important areas of the development process. We need new investment tools. We have now passed a law about a new fund which will gather Greek assets in order to monetize, either through privatization or through other means, by using those assets, nurturing those assets. Greece, for historical reasons, since the Ottoman times, has a great deal of real estate assets that have been left to their own devices, have never been nurtured, they have never been brought together for the good of the Greek people. We need investment on the argument of the lick of paint. You have the beach volley stadium that was built for the Olympic Games. It is a tragedy to go and see it now there. It's completely derelict, it's completely in a state of decay. Why can't that go into the fund? Why can't we get investment for a lick of paint to make it presentable? And why can't that be a centre for beach volley in the World League, and also for training Swedes, Norwegians, Latvians, Russians, who might want in the winter to be able to practice their game in climatic conditions which are a bit more congenial than they are in those countries. And that goes for a lot of athletic facilities. There is a big demand, and many of these northern athletes go to the southern hemisphere where they could go to Greece. So there is a lot of thought going how you can employ Greek assets to be able to change the development model. But we need to do many other things at the same time for the real economy. One is dealing the issue of tax evasion. Up to now, and before 2008, more or less rich people in Greece paid taxes on a voluntary basis. And it's absolutely vital that we change that, and we are changing that. The good news is that this year we are above target, not only in general revenues, but also in increasing the collectability of VAT. And I'm proud to be the finance minister who knows that the record winners in that increase in VAT are Mykonos, Rhodes, and Santorini. It needed a left-wing government to come into power to ensure that those three richest islands, in terms of tourists and the type of tourists that go, actually pay some VAT. These are the non-parametric measures which allow us to reduce tax rates and the burden on the middle classes and the small, medium-sized enterprises. The final issue before I conclude is the public administration. And I've discussed this with Werner, and he'll have to excuse me for giving the same example of how bad things have been in Greece in the last 40, 50 years about the public administration and clientelistic politics. Every morning in my ministry, my chief of staff comes to me with a huge amount of files that I have to sign. Some of these files are a nurse in one northern town in Greece, Veria, going to another northern town in Alexandroupoli. And the Minister of Finance signs that piece of paper, and not only does he sign it, there are 15 other signatures above that. You will say inefficient. You will say how bureaucratic. Well, it's inefficient, and it isn't, because it was part of the clientelistic system. Because if I didn't sign it, or some of the 14 people before that did not sign it, what would happen traditionally in Greece? Somebody would come to the person who's supposed to sign it. They would say, but you haven't signed my transfer. I need to go to Xanthi because my husband is now. And the minister or somebody low down would say, yes, but you've always been voting for the Blues. Isn't it time for the Greens to get some of your votes? Not necessarily corruption in a manila envelope, but corruption of political patronage and clientelism. It is absolutely crucial for us that that changes, that we have a public administration that people feel meets the demands. There's no point in having a large fund. There's no point in introducing a new investment law and new investment institutions if people don't feel that they're going to act properly and professionally. So that is a big task. But let me return to the main theme. I have avoided talking about more Europe and less Europe. I think most people have decided that the way forward is a better, fairer, and a more growth-orientated Europe. But Europe, not just the Eurozone, is in danger. It reminds me of a patient who has had a mild heart attack, but at the same time has high blood pressure, has high sugar levels, and has the first signs of kidney failure. The small heart attack can be very, very dangerous. And it could be, the next heart attack could actually be fatal. So without a change in the direction, I believe the next heart attack, large or small, could be fatal. We know some of the answers. Nobody has a monopoly of truth and knows all the answers. But we have to begin a proper discussion on both monetary and fiscal policy in the Eurozone, on what social fairness to give people a belief that Europe is also for them, and we also need a new development model, a model that produces proper jobs, real jobs, jobs that are fulfilling, jobs that are not only part-time, jobs that give people a sense of belonging, a sense of safety, a sense of participation in society. Europe faces this challenge, and it needs good people to do good things and not allow bad people to do bad things. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Altesse Royale, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, Minister de Euclid, thank you very much. I promised you, ladies and gentlemen, an inspiring and a passionate speech. You got it. Thank you very much for that. We, as the EU Bank, obviously will go out for the foxes now, not to shoot them, but to help them find the best ways to be of assistance to this country that is on a way of recovery, but urgently needs assistance and friends. So thank you very much for being here today, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to invite you now for a drink, because you have been given so much food for thought that there might be lots of things to be discussed among all of us, and I wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you.